Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And full disclosure, I did not expect that I'd be getting this out anywhere close to on time this week. Between the madness surrounding my best hits of the decade list, that's unfortunately still happening, and having to prep a full review for another project, all missed the week of my birthday, this week was kind of wild. A little overstuffed. But hey, I'm nothing if not mostly consistent, so welcome back on the Pulse. So we got 8 albums on the docket this week, but let's get things started with, from Fiona Apple, Fetch the Bolt Cutters.
I won't shut up. Kick me under the table all you want. I won't shut up.
I already spoke at length about this one, an absolutely great and layered album that can find remarkable emotional balance and nuance in its rawness, but it's also married to a compositional structure that by design might be a little more hit and miss, and that can lead to some moments that can't quite strike true. I mean, imperfection might have been part of the point, but how that'll hit, that's kind of a tricky nut to crack, or in this case, bolt to cut. But for me, very solid 8 out of 10, absolutely worth hearing. Check out the review if you get a chance. Next up, from Uncommon NASA, Ornate.
It's not the riches, it's the overall habitat I can't place, but I wanted the visuals.
So this was an EP that dropped a couple of weeks ago, but now that it's available on all streaming platforms and I've got a bit of breathing room in my schedule, I figured I'd discuss this newest quick outing from Uncommon NASA, all produced by Lyle Horowitz. And it's actually really good, mostly because opposite cleaner production with firmer grooves, NASA's sharper personality and wordplay pops a lot more. And there's some okay hooks on this thing too. Now of course, I do prefer his work with a little more texture, so I like the darker guitar gurgle on Words Sung, and the almost gothic twinkles and texture on A Walk on East 11th Street. But I'll also say that right now, the writing is the real star of the show here, from highlighting the increasingly forced smiles to preserve jobs under strained capitalism, to the bizarre ramp-up of intensity that creators feel when you're stuck inside and feel like you should be making something. Yeah, I've been there. A Walk on East 11th Street is probably the best song here, though, as it juxtaposes how unnerving that intensity can be as an older guy in a young man's game, even further boxed in as he has to make the choice to live and accept the tough reality as he sees the projections and positivity of influencers that he can't fake. And there's a line about YouTube here that struck me as being almost too real, these days or otherwise. Now again, as I've said before about Uncommon NASA, he can be very niche, blunt, wordy, complicated New York underground hip-hop that's rich with symbolism, but here it's immediate enough that you think you should get it more easily. And you know what, I'm not sure how much resonance this will have once the lockdown ends, but you know what, I still really liked it all the same. Extremely strong 7 out of 10, check this out. Great stuff. Next up, from Dryjacket, Going Out of Business. I'll be blunt, probably should have vetoed this album, but I'm including it on the schedule in order to make a point. Just because there's a genre or subgenre or trend within a genre that I might have a preference towards does not mean I'm gonna like everything I hear within it. Case in point, Dryjacket, who on their sophomore album decided their way of making their fusion of Midwestern emo and pop punk was forgetting anything close to an interesting hook, getting lead singers with no edge and a distinctly sanitized mid-2000s pop punk voice, and injecting a bunch of fidgety math rock noodling and trumpets into the verses instead of competent drum mixing or a decent groove. I can't even put it in the American football camp of being more atmospheric and thoughtful because there's no attempt to create an atmosphere. And it's genuinely alarming how tepid and boring it all is, sounding more like the act in this genre that might actually get the occasional commercial because it is so anonymous. Now, this would be where I would go to the writing to find something to redeem them, and yet somehow it made me like them even less. I get trying to juxtapose cheery, upbeat melodies and clean, bouncy production with a lot of sullen introspection, underweight anxiety, curdled anger, and at one point an outright suicide wish. I mean, it's trying to make an obvious point about how people disguise their true angst in normal suburbia. But where the best of the emo revival is populist, or at least trying to see beyond the bleak future, there's this mean-spirited pettiness to a lot of these tracks that's far less likable and far far more dissonant with any sense of tone. So somehow you wind up with the worst of both worlds. Emo that will wallow in stasis and insufferability, backed up by the sort of anonymous but chipper tones that don't have the hooks nor texture to make it all that interesting. In other words, it's not good. Extremely late 4 to 10, and frankly, I'm being generous. Next up, from EoB, Earth.
Until I found the Shangri-La. I didn't really know I could feel so old.
Okay, so if you're seeing this name for the first time and are a little confused, don't be. This is the first solo side project from Radiohead guitarist Ed O'Brien, working with legendary producer Flood and a host of guest stars in order to assemble this, including his bandmate bassist Colin Greenwood, Glenn Kochi of Wilco, Adrian Utley of Portishead, even Laura Marling back here for another week. And if you're expecting this to sound like Radiohead, I'd say it's not quite exact, but there is a parallel to a certain strain of alternative and even progressive rock rooted in the late 90s, early 2000s in England. Think Elbow or Travis or Porcupine Tree. Now, let me stress, that's an era of prog rock I really like, full of interesting melodic structures and the acoustics balanced out with good grooves and textured drums, and Flood's mixing is top-notch in order to give these songs the contemplative, studied, tasteful air of that era. And if that's all you need to get you in the door, you'll likely really like this, but if you dig even a little deeper, you don't really find much to flesh this out beyond that pastiche. For one, it's hard not to go to songs like Long Time Coming and appreciate the obvious light bulb Sun parallel, but if you're asking for the album to take any chances in the composition beyond the smoothest possible tones that are then dragged through compositions lacking a lot of unique hooks, a few which seem to be trying to go for what I presume is a dance groove and they go on long, that's where you realize that nearly all these pieces are lacking any sort of distinctive lyrical flair beyond some half-formed pleas in order to preserve some form of love in the world around us, outside of the vague anti-Wall Street sentiments of banksters. That's about the closest thing this album gets to half-hearted rock intensity with one of the weakest "you fucks" I've heard on record. Well, look, preservation is the apt sentiment here, because when you factor in Ed O'Brien sounding better more as a Radiohead backing vocalist than a frontman, a few programmed drum patterns that don't really match all that well, and some really weak hooks, it feels like a facsimile of what might have been if Radiohead hadn't bucked trends and went electronic. And beyond nostalgia for what might have been, I hate to say it, but there's just not a lot here. 6 out of 10. If you like these tones, you'll probably like this album, but I kind of wanted a little more. That's all. Next up from the Smith Street Band, Don't Waste Your Anger.
I don't know how I'll live without you.
I've been told by a lot of people that I would really like this act, given my fondness for hard-scrabble folk punk and Frank Turner specifically. And going to the Smith Street Band's back catalog certainly shows a lot of that influence. But outside of that, I've actually liked a fair bit of what I've heard here. Their albums can kind of run together and certainly feel a little shaggy in the composition and production, especially recently as they've made some rather questionable choices. But you know what though, they're gonna wrangle together a good enough hook with some smart, detailed writing, and I was curious where this Australian act would go next. And it's a Smith Street Band album, alright? I guess my frustration comes in how there are some basic things this band could do to go to the next level, and at this point they're just not happening, and I don't know why. Specifically in the production. When you have a band with a potent singer like Will Wagner, why never center him well in the mix? And why is your mixing as a whole just so muddy? It continues to do a big disservice to some great hooks and makes potent or distinctive melodies really start to run together. That's before all the synths and the glittery keyboards slide in to clutter the mix that badly needs some focus, especially in the grooves on the final third of the album. And if someone could explain that flattened drone all over the back half of Big Smoke, please tell me why. Now, you'd think the content would be able to punch through it regardless, being this anthemic, especially given its bloody hangdog desperation that if he's not already at rock bottom, he's certainly gonna wind up there. But as you get deeper in, it's never a tailspin that's reversed or even provided a lot of unique context, and the love sickness begins to really curdle by the end. There's a hidden downside to the self-loathing side of this side of folk punk. Not only can it start to sound discordantly whiny, but the self-aggrandizing pity can run sour if not tempered or emphasized well, and frankly, it's a prime example of hitting that weaker note. Look folks, I really wanted to love this one because it does have the hooks to get there, just little else. 6 out of 10 for fans only, really. Next up from Enter Shikari, Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. Okay, cue the usual monologue of how this genre is not really for me and I don't have the greatest depth with it. But I feel like I've got a little bit more wiggle room with Enter Shikari here, who started off in the off-loath electronic-core subgenre before sliding into more accessible electronic rock. And having listened to all their albums now, they really aren't my thing. Most because in between the decent hooks and some of the hyperbolic to ridiculous politics, they get a reputation for choosing some of the worst possible synths for contrast and embellishment I've heard in recent memory, and the mixing doesn't help either. Even 2017's The Spark, easily their most accessible and probably best album beforehand, it had this problem, a frenetic mishmash of elements that never fused properly. And thus, it's a little bit awkward for me to go to this album, by far their cleanest and most hook-ready and accessible project, full of some very obvious glances at 21 Pilots, maybe even embracing more of the abrasive tones outside of the vocals that could be so hit and miss in the past, and yet I'd argue it might just be their most likable album to date. Now, let me make this clear, it's absolutely still overproduced in the frenetic pile-up of electronic layers and synthetic vocal filters, and unfortunately, it's the sort of overproduction that winds up feeling kind of wonky and uneven from track to track, which can make for an incredibly vibrant listen, but not one that's remotely consistent. But the quality of the overproduction and the bombast is considerably better, and when you pair it with the stronger overall hooks and more cohesive compositions, it leads to a better album. And yet, even as I'll praise some of the best ever hooks and experimentation on Crossing the Rubicon, or The Dreamer's Hotel, or Satellites, where there's some of the warping passages almost sound adjacent to PC music, I will say the content still doesn't quite get there, where about half the project wants to confront a collapsing world and snap all the puppet strings and spark larger change, where the other half just seems like it wants to take the piss out of all of it or play in some gallows humor. Now, the one inspired lyrical idea is the apocalypse conceit, privileged folks who are obsessed with thinking about the world's end but never do much about it. But by the end of the album, in all that deconstruction, it kind of winds up reinforcing how they might be just like it in a really bizarrely upbeat way. Now, granted, Enter Shikari have never exactly been all that deep of a band, and I'm more inclined to just take it all at face value, which is oversold, overproduced, gloriously messy, but generally pretty fun for what it is. As such, it's a light 7 out of 10. Frankly, better than I expected, but I get the funny feeling this should be better. Next up, from Rina Sawayama, I really should have been on the Rina Sawayama train years ago, which can kind of be weird for someone to say about a relatively underground artist who only released a small EP back in 2017. But that EP was genuinely great, taking a flagrantly retro late 90s, early 2000s pop R&B sound and then fusing it with rock elements and lyrics that were ridiculously sharp and incisive. So after covering one of her songs on IGTV a couple weeks back, I'm at Spectrum Pulse FO semi-regularly there, I was actually pretty damn excited for this, and it was worth it. Folks, this was everything I was hoping from that Poppy album from earlier this year that it would be. A vibrant and colorful balance between pop, R&B, rock, and splashy metal textures that might have their most obvious reference point around the turn of the millennium, maybe early 2000s, but to me feels much more rooted in modern J-pop and J-rock, especially with some of the splashier synth work and the determination to drill into a huge crowd-pleasing hook on songs like Paradise or the Christina Aguilera-esque Who's Gonna Save You Now, or the fantastic power ballad Chosen Family, and she actually will bring in the key changes to elevate to the next level. Now granted, her palette also dabbles in splashes of G-Funk and New Jack Swing on Love Me For Me, some trap on Akasaka Said and Snakeskin, some new metal on SGFU, and even manages to make the obvious Evanescence influence on Dynasty tolerable, and that's a factor of content. What I find captivating fascinating about this project is how it might seem like she's making otherwise conventionally structured pop songs that don't shy away from the big hooks in the modern production, but also capture both more nuance and a real arc of self-actualization. But not just your standard self-esteem anthems, as Sawayama is specifically focusing on complicated family legacy and generational wealth she doesn't feel she deserves, and a lot of messy feelings about her former home in Japan, a home that she barely knows and doesn't want to caricature in her music, even as the industry is rushing to put her in a box and she has to grapple with that insight and fighting. But it's not all dour either. She knows how to walk the tightrope between emotive melancholy and making some genuinely fun music, which, as I've said, can walk a bit of a blurry line on cuts like Excess, but more often than not can really work, especially enforcing the sharp juxtapositions while still sounding cohesive. That's why you get the J-rock elements and they really work. And when you factor in an album that only gets better the deeper you get into it, seriously, Bad Friend comes out of nowhere and somehow manages to crystallize all the nostalgia for a year I didn't even know I had on pop radio, I'm thrilled to say hype is real. 8 out of 10, this is special. Get on board now. And finally, from DaBaby, Blame It On Baby.
I made my bitch talk to me when we fuck. Talk back. Big rocks on my wrist, I bust.
Alright, let's keep this short. I understand why DaBaby rushed to drop a new album now. Serve the fanbase with the knowledge he can't really compete with the big releases likely delayed until later this year, even without a major single push. I get it. But it's also the textbook example of a rush job that makes DaBaby's impressive charisma bleed away into some really weak singing and a flow and content that he struggles to switch up. And when you have production this slapdash and undercooked, the lead and bass mixing and the lack of strong melody has been an issue his entire run, and somehow it's even worse here, but it smacks of bad management that told him that he needed to release something now, and instead of actually refining those variations in his delivery and flow, then deliver throwaway mixtape quality, which also applies to his bars in every guest appearance. It's a bad sign where his sex references alongside taking your girl are repeatedly just disgusting, and there's very little of the same flair and wit that made previous projects have more character. And even when you might think there are moments where he seems like he's gonna show more vulnerability, it's nearly always a bait and switch, which really cheapens any attempt at real emotion. The closest we get is Rockstar, where he tries to croon rap opposite Roddy Ricch to his daughter about his Walmart shooting issue, but even Roddy's not staying on topic or matching the attempted mood. And outside of Jump with Youngboy Never Broke Again for just braggadocious gunplay that I kinda got into, and a remake of Ashanti's Baby on Nasty with Megan Thee Stallion, which is a song I didn't even like in 2002, that's about the best it gets. Look, I still think DaBaby has a lot of potential, but this was rushed, it was a bad idea, it reflects very questionable management and production, and none of it speaks to a progression so much as a backslide. So yeah, DaBaby, I'm blaming this on you, because it's not good. 4 out of 10, I would say the fans would like it, but I'd probably say skip it. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I'm hoping things are going to start to slow down eventually here. I've just been crazy busy. But hey, if you guys actually want to get involved in putting stuff on my schedule, again, it's this time of year, tough, still going into weeks into this lockdown here, I get why, but hey, Patreon's right over there. I'd be happy for your support. Beyond that, comments are down there. Have fun. Until then, I'm Mark. You're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse. And I'll see you next time.